If you're sewing diagonal seams, then you'll want to end up with nice sharp points like this pinwheel block just here, right in the middle, and with this flying geese block here, where you've got a nice little point coming into the beak of the other flying goose. But how do you do that and get all those sharp points? That is exactly what I'm covering in this video. So who am I? I am Kim. This is Quilt with Kim. You, my lovely, are very, very welcome. Let's start with the easier of the two, which is the flying geese block. With a flying geese block, what we are trying to do is get this diagonal point here of the beak, as I like to call it, and we want it pointed directly into the bottom or the base of the beak above it. So can you see the seam line of this top flying goose or flying geese block matches the top point of the bottom flying geese block or flying goose block. There's a bit of discussion about whether a singular one is flying goose or flying geese, and I think people get too het up about it. I like to call it a flying goose if it's on its own, and then flying geese if there's lots of them. And why can't we have that? Anyway, I digress. So we have this little point here matches exactly at the top here, if I can get it to focus, with the flying goose block above it. Flying geese block above it makes that little point. How do we do that? So we're going to start with a couple of these flying geese blocks, and if you've made your flying geese blocks, you'll know that you have got a 1/4 inch seam allowance above the top of your little point here. So this is one block, and you can see there's the point, and just above that you've got the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you've made some of these blocks and you've got that gap, then you are exactly correct in how you are making these. These are exactly what you want to be doing. When we attach the one on top of it, this has got a 1/4 inch seam allowance built into this block, and essentially that, I appreciate it doesn't work quite like that, but that block will, once it's sewn on, will meet at the top of that little diagonal point. So we start by putting these two together, right sides together. Okay, this is the same as normal. Now, if I flip it over, and we're going to have a look at the point on the other side. So if I hold it up to camera, you can see here where my stitch lines cross, which is what happens when we sew those two sky pieces onto our flying goose. I've got a whole tutorial on how to make the flying goose block or flying geese block on this channel, which I'll link up below for you if you want to learn how to make them from scratch. But you can see on the back, you've got a little cross here where the seam lines match. And when we put our stitch line down here, when we're sewing the two blocks together, so there's the one underneath, when we're putting those two together, what we want is our 1/4 inch seam allowance, or a 1/4 inch stitch line, will pass exactly over that little cross point there. That is what you're aiming for. What you don't want is fingers crossed and hoping that your stitch line will just cross quite happily over there. You can do that, but I've found a little extra step in the process will oddly speed it all up. So let's get under the machine and I'll show you how to do that. The first thing that you want to do is put your stitch length up. Now, this machine is set on 5.5mm stitch width because that is where the setting is for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Over here is set as a 2mm, which is what we'd normally want our stitch length to be for sewing patchwork or for doing our piecing. We want to put this up to the maximum that your machine will go, which is going to be probably 5mm. That puts our machine into a big stitch, which allows us to baste with our machine or tack with our machine. And what we're going to do is secure our seam and make sure that we can get our seam crossing that little crosshairs, if you like, on the flying geese block, so that we can get that diagonal point. Okay, so let's get it under the machine. So we've got our two flying geese blocks all lined up around the edges, just as we would normally. And then what we're going to do is stitch with our big 5mm basting stitch about an inch, inch and a half. Don't overstress it. So we're going either side of our little crosshairs here. And the aim of our game is to get that big stitch line, those big stitches, to go through your little crosshairs there. Okay, so that's what we're going to do first. Now, if you get it right, and we'll check in a moment, if you get it right first time, and marvellous, we can go on to stitch it. But if we get it wrong and it misses, because sometimes they do, then it's very easy to take out that little basting stitch line. It will take you a nanosecond, and then we can try again. Okay, so I'm going to line it up just as I normally would, and I'm going to drop my needle. It's on the 1/4 inch, and let's just see how it goes. So I'm going to go through, and as I'm doing this, what I'm trying to do is get the needle to cross those crosshairs. I don't think this has, if I'm being honest, but I'm going to just carry on for another second or two, and then I can cut the thread, and we can see now. Look, look at that. Can you see how that basting stitch line has missed those crosshairs? Now, as I open it up, you can see quite clearly that I have completely missed that point. Can you see there in the middle of your screen? So the little white dotty fabric is coming to the point there, but there's still some of this pinky flowery fabric that there's the gap between the next flying goose. So we don't want that. Now, what you can do, if you want, is just leave those basting stitches in whilst we try again. Okay, ultimately we can take them out, but for now, let's keep them in, and we know that we're going to have to shuffle over to the left just a little bit. Okay, so it may be that I didn't have everything in the right position to start with, so let's try again. As I come down slowly, I can look and I can make sure my needle crosses through. Okay, so let's get that out of the machine and have a look. Now, can you see here, this second stitch line is cutting those little crosshairs. Now that looks good. What we don't want to do is have a little blunt beak, which could happen if you're too far this side. But let's open it up and have a look. And I think we have made it there. So can you see that? We've now got an exact point coming into this other flying goose here, and that is exactly what we want. If we are happy with that, then we can drop our stitch length back to where we need it to be. So I'm just going to put mine down to 2, and I'm going to keep the basting in whilst I do this. You can take the basting out at the end, but I am now going to start at the top of the block where I'd normally do the whole seam all in one go, line it up, and I'm going to stitch my 1/4 inch, and I'm going to go straight over this basting stitch and make sure I still cut through those little crosshairs with my stitch line. Okay, I may have missed that. See, it happens to us too. To be honest, I'm too far away from the machine and it's actually quite difficult to see. However, don't worry. Let's have a look at my stitch line. Now, can you see here, there's the stitch line coming across. And actually what I've done is I've hit that original stitch line that was off. And I know that I have missed that point. Now, I could take all of that out. Do you know, I cheat sometimes and I don't take it out. Don't tell anybody, will you? Let's shuffle that down. I think I was following the wrong line for my 1/4 inch. So let's get going again. As an aside, if you're thinking, oh my God, she doesn't know what she's doing. Yes, I do. But I also think it's really important to show you when things go wrong and what I would do about it, because I can promise you none of us who teach sewing has everything go absolutely perfectly all the time, because it doesn't work like that. Life doesn't work like that. So I will show you mistakes and all, because that will help you the most. So let's just carry on. And we're going to make sure this is my basting line that I was cutting through those little crosshairs that I knew was correct. So I've lined up with that, And looks like we're going to get all the way through in the right place. And stitch to the end. So I think what had happened, that first 1/4 inch stitch line I did was just too far over to the right and not in the correct place, because I couldn't really see from up on high. Now you can see here I've got two stitch lines. It's like little tram lines running across. Am I particularly bothered about taking that first one out? No, I'm not. And the reason why is because it's within the seam allowance. If it was this side and it was wrong, I would take it out. But if it was in the seam allowance, sometimes life is too short for taking out every little bit of wrong stitching. So I'm just going to leave that there. Now with the basting, you can take that out if you want to. And more importantly, if you can see the basting on the right side of your fabric, then take it out. If you can't see it, like here, leave it in. It's up to you, but don't make extra work for yourself. So there we have it on the flying geese. If I turn this around, you can see now that I've got a nice pointy beak from the bottom flying geese block into the top flying geese block, and when that is pressed, that will look very beautiful. So that is our flying geese block. But how do we do a pinwheel? Because we've got diagonal seams coming in from all angles. So let's have a look at that next. With our pinwheel block, what we are aiming for is this nice, perfect meeting of the points in the middle. Again, if you want to learn how to make this block, I've got a whole tutorial on how to make this one, which you'll find down in the description below. But it is made up of 4 half square triangle blocks. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are joined together, and then the 2 halves are then joined together again. So let's have a look at it broken down. This one here, let's just zoom the camera out a little bit so you can see. There we go. This one here is where I've got 2 half square triangles and I've joined them together, and you can see again at the bottom I've got this left hand flowery triangle meeting the bottom point of this white dotty one with the pink dots on it, and there is a 1/4 inch gap there, which is my seam allowance, and that is what we want when we've joined 2 half square triangles together. When I have put the bottom 2 into place and we've stitched them all together, that's where we get that nice point in the middle section here. That's what we're aiming for. Okay, so what we need to do first, this is 2 stages of getting that accuracy. We have to sew the 2 half square triangles together to make sure that we've got a nice accurate point here with our 1/4 inch seam, because if we don't have this in place first, then we won't get that nice sharp point in the middle. So let's do that first. Let's move that out of the way. I'm going to put right sides together. We'll ignore the fact that that is all folded over, because that happens with pressing sometimes. Now, can you see here, as I've turned it over, those 2 diagonal seams will now butt up against each other. So that's what we want to do first. I do want to make sure that the rest of the block is all sort of lining up around the edges. But what I'm very interested in is this little top bit here. And if I open it up, because this is the corner of my pinwheel, this is what ends up in the center. We want to make sure that these 2 sections, like the sails, if you like, the colored fabric of our pinwheel, are meeting exactly in the middle on that seam line. And you can see as I've folded this top one back that we can butt these 2 seams up to one another, and that's what we're aiming for. Can you see there? Now can you see that top one has shuffled over to the left a bit, and we don't want that. So let's tell it what for and get it back into position. A little bit of time here, making sure that it is in the right place, will help you at the next stage. And again, we are going to base this, but I am going to put a pin in it just to start with to help us. All right, so our seam will be in this, on this edge here. Now it's quite difficult to stitch from the top here because there's nothing really for the machine to hold on. So what I'm going to do is just turn it over to the other side, and I'm just going to put a little basting stitch down there exactly as we did before with that stitch length up to 5. So this bit is no different. What I might do is put the pin over on this side. So let's just check that nothing's moved. And let's get a pin in there to hold it. And then I'm ready to do a basting stitch just down into that corner. So let's get the machine out. So I've got my stitch length on a basting stitch, and all I'm going to do is just stitch down to the edge here. So let's put my presser foot down and stitch carefully. I can leave the needle in because I'm not going to go over the needle. It's fine and out of the way, just in case anybody is panicking. Okay, so that's got right down to the edge there. So there is my basting stitch. And what I want to do is just open it up and check that I have got that point at the top here, which is what I am after. Can you see that? And I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance there. So everything looks okay here. If I'm happy with that, which I am, then I can stitch down the whole seam. Make sure you're sewing down the right edge. Make sure you put your stitch length back down to where you need it to be. And let's sew down there. Again, if you want to take these basting stitches out afterwards, if they're showing, yes, you can. If you're lazy and they're not showing, you can just leave them in there. I'll probably have all the quilt police shouting at me, but sometimes it's not worth worrying about all these things. Okay, so that's my stitch line gone in. Let's just do another quick check before I do anything else. So we can see that the point here is perfect, and I've got my nice 1/4 inch seam allowance there ready for the next stage. So what we're going to do now is press the seam, but press it open. With pinwheels, you get quite a bulky seam just in the middle here where all those points meet, and it makes your life a lot easier if you press this seam open. So that's what I'm going to do. And whilst I'm on the iron, I'm just going to sort that little seam out there as well, because we don't really want untidy seams. Okay, so we're all pressed on the back with our seam open. I've sorted out that dodgy seam over there. So we're now ready for the next bit. I'm going to just cut off those loose threads at the top. Get rid of those. This is the one that I made earlier where it is going to join up to make our pinwheel. Now, if you're not making pinwheels, but you're just still trying to match diagonal points, this is exactly the same process. It doesn't matter what you're doing, you still follow this process. So we've made sure these two half square triangles are meeting beautifully together, and we've got that point there. We've got our 1/4 inch seam allowance there, and we can see on the one I made earlier, we've got the 1/4 inch seam allowance ready to go there. So we're going to put those right sides together, and then we're going to do a couple of things. We can see here, if I hold that like that, you can see we've got all sorts of bits and pieces going on. Let's see if I can zoom in. Now you can see here, we've got, there's our seam allowance, there's the point of two of our triangles meeting, and then on this top piece that we're going to sew together, we've got the same thing going on. We've got our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and there is our triangle that we need to match that point here with this point here. We also need to match this center seam here where we have joined two half square triangle blocks together. Okay, so if we put that in place, get it lined up sort of in position, And then we get it roughly in position, and then we can fiddle. Now, if I hold one in my right hand and one in my left hand, what I can do first is match this center seam. And just like before, we can roll that up to make sure that that is butting up, because that'll give us that nice center look that we want to get all these points matching together. Now, the other thing is I want to make sure that this point and this point match, and then these two side angles match as well. So what I'm going to do is, without getting it too far out, I'm going to judge my eye and match those two up. You can stick a pin in it through the points. What I've discovered is that it sort of shuffles around a little bit, so I tend not to do that. I tend to do it a little bit more by eye. I do pin it in the minute, but you'll find some tutors put a pin through the cross, and yes, it works, but it's a bit difficult to keep it there, and as I said, it shuffles around, so I try not to do that. I try to judge it by eye, and we can judge where those points match. And if it should match, if the edges, I'm just turning it around to show you, if the edges are matching, and we can see here that this edge isn't matching, so my points aren't likely to match either. All right, so it is a little bit of fiddling. We're not going to shy away from that. So we can see my center seam is still lining up, and I'm rolling it up. I'm making sure that those side diagonals are lining up, and I'm matching up that top seam. It is much easier to do when you are closer to it than I am. Now I think those are in position. I'm going to hold it with my left hand because I'm right-handed. So what I'm going to do is stick some pins in whilst holding on at the top here. And I'm going to put 3 pins in for good measure. There's always a dodgy pin in my pin collection, and it's always the one that I pick up, and I really must get rid of it. Okay, so I've got 3 pins in position on there. Now I'm going to get my stitch length back up to that basting length, so I'm moving it back up to 5mm again, just like we did previously. So I've just done that. So let's turn that round. Ultimately, we are going to stitch down this right-hand edge here, but first of all, just like we did previously, we are going to do a little basting stitch of about 1 inch, 1.5 inches over those pins. You are going to sew really slowly with a very big stitch, so don't worry too much about hitting the pins. I would not ever sew over pins at speed because you're asking for trouble. But if we've got a really big stitch length and you're going very slowly, what you'll find is the needle slides off the pin rather than hits it. Okay, so whilst we're doing this, I do want to make sure that all the other edges are just lining up nicely and they're all neat and tidy. So let's get this under the machine. So I'm going to put my presser foot down. I've got my basting stitch length on, and I'm going to sew very slowly over those pins. If you look at your fabric whilst you're doing this, because you will be a lot closer than I am, you can actually see the back of that peak. Remember the little peak at the front where those triangles met? You will see the reverse of that on the back. You'll just see a little point in your seam allowance, and that's what we're aiming to cross. So I've done my little 1.5 inch basting stitch. Let's cut the thread and have a look at that. Okay, so you can see that I've got the basting stitch gone across here, across my pins. I'm going to take those pins out and we're going to see what happens. That is perfect. So we can see here, drum roll please, that we have got our points matching perfectly in the middle. If there are any gaps or these points don't match, then you can adjust that basting. You can take the basting out and you can start again until you are ready. And by the way, if you're looking at this thinking she's got a gap there, I haven't. It's a white flower, which is a bit disconcerting and it looks like it hasn't matched, but it has. So I'm happy with that basting. I'm going to leave it exactly there. I've got all my points matching. I'm going to turn this back around. I'm not taking the basting out. I'm matching up my edges. I'm putting my stitch length back down to where I want it to be. And then without taking the basting out, I'm going to simply stitch down that side edge just as we would normally. And I can go straight over that basting line because I know that basting line is in exactly the right place. Okay. I'll stop a minute and just line up those raw edges, and then off we go again. Okay, let's get that off the machine and let's put it under the camera so we can have a look. So let's open this up to have a look, and we can see that we've got all of our points matching perfectly in the middle. And as I said, it doesn't matter whether you're doing a pinwheel or whether you're doing your flying geese, the same method of matching those pointy bits, the diagonal points, will work on pretty much any block that you are working on. Just follow the steps, and like all things, practice makes perfect on this. As you practice and go through those stages, you will get better, I absolutely promise you. If this has helped, please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I will love you and leave you for now, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.